Welcome to Late Night Explainer. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let the weight of the day begin to sink down through the bed, down through the floor, down into the quiet dark beneath everything. There is nowhere you need to be tonight. There is nothing you need to solve. You only need to lie here and listen, and let me walk you slowly, very slowly, into one of the oldest stories there is. A story so old it predates the cities, predates the written word, predates almost everything you would call civilization. And the strange thing, the thing I want to whisper to you as you drift, is that this story came first, that everything else grew out of it like moss over a stone. Tonight we are going to walk the entire story of trade, the whole long river of it, from a time before money to a time of global empires, how buying and selling this small and ordinary thing you have done 1,000 times without thinking quietly built the world you live in. Take your time with me, there is no hurry in this. If you fall asleep somewhere in the middle, that is exactly as it should be. The story will keep flowing whether you are awake to hear it or not, the way a river keeps flowing past a sleeping town. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Leave it somewhere in the comments if you feel like it, a city, a country, a quiet room. I read them, all of them. And there is something lovely about imagining all these scattered lights, all these people lying in the dark in different time zones, listening to the same old story. And if you are new here, you might gently press subscribe so the next slow journey can find its way to you. That is all. We can let the asking go now and sink into the real thing. So here is where we begin. And I want to begin by overturning something, by taking a belief that almost everyone carries, a tidy little story you were probably taught in school, and turning it over in our hands until we can see the other side of it. You were told, perhaps, that money began with barter. The story goes like this. Once upon a time, long ago, people simply swapped things. You had a chicken, your neighbor had a basket of grain, and the two of you traded directly one for the other. And this was clumsy, the story says. This was inconvenient, because what if you wanted grain, but the person with grain did not happen to want your chicken just then? And so, to fix this awkward problem, clever humans invented money. A neutral thing everyone would accept, and from that invention, the whole machinery of commerce was born. It is a clean story, it is a satisfying story, and it is almost certainly wrong. This is the part I want you to fall asleep believing, because it is truer than what you woke up believing this morning. Money did not come from barter. Barter, in the way the school books describe it, the way two strangers haggling over a chicken and a sack of grain, that scene that feels so ancient and so obvious may never really have been how human beings organize themselves at all. The idea comes to us mostly from one very famous source. In 1776, the Scottish thinker Adam Smith wrote it down in the book that more or less founded modern economics. He described this imagined past, the inconvenience of barter, money arriving to smooth it all over. And because Adam Smith was so respected, so foundational, economists repeated his story for 2 centuries. They taught it, they built on it. It became simply the way everyone assumed the world had worked. But here is the trouble. In all that time, in 200 years of looking, the anthropologists, the people who actually go and study human societies, never found it. They went out into the world looking for a place that ran on pure barter, a society that swapped goods directly and then, one day, invented money to make it easier. And they came back empty-handed every single time. The anthropologist Caroline Humphrey at Cambridge put it about as plainly as a scholar ever puts anything. She said that no example of a barter economy, pure and simple, has ever been described. None, not one. The thing that supposedly stood at the very beginning of all economic life, the the foundation stone of the whole story, had never actually been observed anywhere on Earth. Let that settle for a moment, the way a stone settles into mud at the bottom of a slow river. The origin of money, the thing we are all so sure about, may be a story we simply made up and then forgot we made up. There was a man named David Graeber, an anthropologist, who took this quiet scholarly correction and carried it to a much wider world. In 2011, he wrote a book with a title that tells you exactly where this is all going. He called it Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And his argument, drawn from generations of careful fieldwork, runs in the opposite direction from the schoolbook story. The sequence, he suggested, was reversed. Credit came first, debt came first, obligation came first. And coined money, those hard, bright discs in your pocket, came much, much later, thousands of years later. So if it was not barter, if two strangers haggling over a chicken was never really the beginning, then what was? How did people actually move things between one another in the long ages before there was any money at all? This is the first thread I want to give you to hold as you drift, the first quiet question, and we will follow it through the whole night. If money did not come from barter, where on earth did it really come from? Keep that question loosely in mind. We will answer it slowly by the time we reach the coins and the paper and the strange, ghostly credit of much later ages. For now, just hold it, the way you might hold a smooth pebble in your hand under the blankets. To find the real beginning, we have to imagine ourselves into a very small world. Not a world of strangers and marketplaces, but a world of intimacy. A village, or something smaller than a village. A handful of families who have known one another for their entire lives, whose parents knew one another, whose children will marry one another. A world where everyone knows everyone, and no face in your daily life is a stranger. In a world like that, the cold logic of barter makes very little sense. Picture it. Your neighbor brings down a deer from the hills, far more meat than his family could ever eat before it spoils. Does he stand there and bargain with you, haggling over how many baskets of grain a haunch of venison is worth? Of course not. He gives it to you. He hands you the meat. And nothing is exchanged in that moment except something invisible, something far more durable than grain. He hands you the meat, and you remember. You remember that he gave it, and he knows that you remember. And the next time your own family has a surplus, when your fishing has been good or your harvest has come in heavy, you will give some back to him without anyone ever totting up a price. This is what the scholars call a gift economy, and it is not a quaint exception to the rule of trade. For most of human history, in small, tight-knit communities, it was the rule. Goods moved as gifts, and each gift created an obligation, a soft thread of I owe you and you owe me, woven invisibly through the whole community. Trade at its very root was not a transaction between strangers, it was a relationship between people who would see one another again tomorrow. There is a beautiful and famous example of this, and I want to take you out across the warm Pacific to find it, because it shows you just how far human beings will go to keep these threads of relationship alive, even across the open sea. Early in the 20th century, a researcher named Bronislaw Malinowski went to live among the people of the Trobriand Islands, a scattering of islands off the coast of New Guinea. He stayed for a long time, and he watched, and in 1922 he published what he had learned in a book called Argonauts of the Western Pacific. And among the many things he described, there was one that has fascinated people ever since. He called it the Kula ring. Listen to how strange and how lovely this is, because it cuts right to the heart of what trade really was before it became cold and numerical. Across this ring of islands, separated by miles of open water that had to be crossed in canoes, two kinds of objects traveled endlessly in a great slow circle. One was a set of necklaces made from red shell called sulava. The other was a set of armbands made from white shell called mwali. And here is the pattern. The red shell necklaces, the sulava, travelled around the ring of islands in one direction, clockwise, and the white shell armbands, the mwali, travelled around the same ring in the opposite direction, counterclockwise, around and around, forever, in two patient opposing streams. Now, and this is the part to hold gently as you drift, these objects were not useful. You could not eat a shell necklace, you could not plant it, or wear it into battle, or build a house with it. They were ceremonial valuables, and no single person kept them for long. A man might receive a famous armband, hold it for a while, gain prestige simply from having possessed it, and then he was obliged to pass it on to a partner on another island. To keep it forever would have been to break the whole sacred circle. What were they really trading then, these islanders crossing miles of dangerous ocean to hand over an object no one was allowed to keep? They were trading relationship. They were trading status and trust and a lifelong bond with a partner on a distant island, a partner you might see only rarely, but to whom you were tied by this slow exchange of beautiful, useless things. The Kula ring was not commerce in the way we think of commerce. It was a web of obligation stretched across the sea, a way of saying, across the water, I know you, I am bound to you, we are partners for life. Trade as relationship, not as transaction. Hold that. It is the deep root of everything that follows. So you can begin to feel why the barter story feels wrong. Among people who know one another, you do not haggle. You give and you remember, and the remembering binds you together. Barter, that cold, simultaneous swap, is actually what you do with a stranger, with someone you do not trust and will never see again. And for most of human history, there simply were not many strangers. The stranger is a later invention. The marketplace full of unfamiliar faces is a later invention. The web of obligation came first. But let us be fair to the old story for a moment, because there is a real problem it was trying to solve, even if it solved it wrongly. The economists gave this problem a wonderful, clumsy name. They called it the double coincidence of wants. And once you understand it, you understand exactly why pure barter could never really run a society. Here is the problem. Imagine you are a stranger, and you have grain, and you would like some fish. For a direct swap to happen, for pure barter to work, you cannot simply find someone with fish. You have to find someone who has the fish you want, and who, at that very same moment, wants the grain you are offering. Both things have to line up at once. That is the double coincidence. Your want and their want have to meet, coincidentally, in the same place at the same time, pointing in opposite directions. And how often does that really happen? You have grain, but the fisherman wants a new net, not grain. You have grain, but the potter already has all the grain she needs and wants firewood instead. The wants almost never line up cleanly. So the friction the old story described was real. That part was true. The double coincidence of wants really is a wall that pure barter keeps running into. But the way human beings climbed over that wall was not by inventing coins. It was by using exactly the tools we have already met: credit, debt, the tally of who owes what, social obligation. If the potter does not want your grain today, fine. She takes it anyway, and she remembers, and she owes you. The debt is written into the relationship, even if it is written nowhere else. Long before there were coins to bridge the gap between two wants, there was memory, and there was honor, and there was the long, patient ledger that every small community keeps inside its own collective head. And that word, ledger, brings us to something extraordinary, because there came a point when human communities grew too large to keep the whole ledger in their heads, when the web of obligation became too vast and too tangled for memory alone to hold. And when that happened, something was invented to help. Something so important, so foundational to everything we are, that you might be amazed to learn it was invented for this. Not for poetry, not for prayer, not to record the words of kings or the deeds of gods. It was invented to do the books. I want you to come with me now to one of the oldest places on Earth where this happened, the flat, hot land between two great rivers, the land the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, and to a place within it called Sumer. We are now somewhere around 5,000 years ago, give or take. Roughly 3,300 to 3,000 years before the Common Era, the very dawn of cities. And it is here, in the dust of Sumer, that human beings first began to write. Now here is the thing that nobody tells you, the quiet, beautiful reversal I want you to sink into. When archaeologists dug up the earliest writing, the very first marks that human beings ever pressed into clay, and that we can still read today, they did not find stories. They did not find hymns to the gods or songs about love or the boasts of warriors. What they found overwhelmingly in tablet after tablet after tablet were receipts, tallies, lists, so many measures of grain, so many head of livestock, so many days of labor owed by this person to that one. The first written words of humankind were, more or less, an accounting department. Writing was, in its first centuries, almost entirely a technology for keeping track of who had what and who owed what to whom. The first words human beings ever wrote down were not poems. They were receipts. Let that strange and lovely fact carry you a little deeper towards sleep, because it tells you something profound about what we are. We learn to write not to capture beauty, but to keep our accounts straight, to remember the debts, to hold the ledger of obligation that had grown too heavy for any single mind to carry. And the way this happened, the actual physical path from no writing to writing, is one of my favorite quiet stories in all of human history. And a researcher named Denise Schmandt-Besserat spent her life uncovering it. She laid it out in a book called Before Writing, and once you hear it, you will never quite see a written word the same way again. Before there was any writing at all, the people of Mesopotamia kept their accounts with small clay tokens, little shapes you could hold in your palm. And the genius of it was that each shape meant a thing. A small clay cone might stand for a measure of grain. A clay sphere might stand for a larger measure. A flat disc might stand for a sheep. So if a herder owed a temple 10 sheep, you could keep 10 little discs, and there was your record, sitting in a bowl, a physical memory of a debt, a ledger you could hold in your hand. But there was a problem with loose tokens. They could be lost, they could be added to, or quietly taken away. How could you make a record that could not be tampered with, a debt that stayed fixed once it was agreed? And the solution they found was beautiful. They took the tokens for a particular transaction and they sealed them inside a hollow ball of clay, a little clay envelope. The scholars call these bulle. You put your 10 sheep discs inside, you sealed the clay ball shut, and now the record was locked. No one could add a token or remove one without breaking the seal, and everyone would see that it had been broken. But of course, this created a new little problem, the kind of problem that quietly drives the whole of human cleverness forward. Once you had sealed the tokens inside the ball of clay, you could no longer see them. You had locked the record so well that you had locked yourself out of reading it. To know how many sheep the debt was, you would have to break the very seal that protected it. And here is the moment. Here is the small, quiet moment, repeated countless times in countless dusty rooms in Sumer, where writing was born. Someone thought to press the tokens into the soft outside of the clay ball before sealing it shut, to make a mark on the surface showing what was inside. 10 little impressions on the outside for the 10 sheep discs sealed within. So now you could read the record without breaking it. You could glance at the marks on the surface and know. And then inevitably someone realized something even simpler. If the marks on the outside already tell you everything, why bother with the tokens inside at all? Why seal anything? Just press the marks into a flat piece of clay, and there is your record. The tokens vanished, the marks remained. The impressions on the clay, which had begun as nothing more than a way to label what was sealed inside a ball, became signs in their own right. And those signs, refined and multiplied over centuries, became a script. The wedge-shaped writing we now call cuneiform, pressed into wet clay with a cut reed, which would carry the records and eventually the laws and at last the stories of Mesopotamia for thousands of years. Sit with the wonder of that as you lie there in the dark. Commerce, the simple need to remember a debt of sheep, literally wrote the first words. The whole vast inheritance of written language, every book you have ever read, every letter, every poem that ever moved you, all of it grew out of a herder and a temple trying to keep straight how many sheep were owed. We learned to write because we needed to remember what we were owed and what we owed. The accountant came before the poet. The receipt came before the hymn. And this leads us to one last small marvel before I let you sink fully towards sleep tonight. One perfect little detail that ties this whole beginning together with a bow. Among these tens of thousands of early economic tablets, these ration lists and debt records and receipts, scholars have searched for the first time. A human individual is named, not a god, not a title, an actual person, a name we can still read, the oldest personal name in all of human history that we can put our finger on. And do you know who it is? Do you know what this oldest named human being was doing when their name was pressed into the clay 5,000 years ago in the city of Uruk? Their name appears to have been Kushim, and Kushim was an accountant, or something very like one. The name Kushim appears on tablets from the city of Uruk from around 3,100 years before the Common Era, and it appears attached to quantities of barley. Kushim was keeping track of grain, counting sacks of barley, doing the books. Think about that. Of all the human beings who had ever lived up to that point, the millions and millions of them across uncounted generations, the very first one whose name has come down to us, the first individual we can name in the whole story of our species, was not a king or a hero or a prophet. It may well have been a bookkeeper named Kushim, sitting in the dust of Uruk, tallying up the barley. The first name in history belongs to commerce, to someone counting what was owed. And so you can begin to feel the shape of the truth we are uncovering tonight, the deep, quiet reversal at the heart of this whole long story. We are used to thinking of trade as a small and rather grubby thing, something that came along after the important business of civilization was already built. Kings and temples first, and then, somewhere off to the side, the merchants and the marketplace. But it is the other way around. The web of obligation came before the marketplace. The need to remember debts came before writing and then gave birth to writing. The first words were receipts. The first name was a bookkeeper's. Before we had cities, we had the exchange that would build them. Trade did not arrive after civilization. Trade, the long, patient business of giving and remembering, of owing and being owed, was quietly there at the very root, holding the whole thing up like water holds up a boat. And we have not even reached the coins yet. We have not reached the great caravans crossing the desert, or the ships running before the monsoon winds, or the gold of an African king so vast it broke a city's economy. We have not reached the strange invention of money proper, or the paper that promised it, or the plague that rode the trade routes alongside the silk. All of that is still ahead of us, waiting, far downriver in the dark. For now, just rest here at the source, at the clay tokens in their bowl, at the little sealed balls with their pressed marks, at Kushim counting barley in the dawn of the world. Let the long story keep flowing on quietly without you, the way the rivers of Sumer kept flowing past the sleeping city. There is nothing you need to remember. There is no debt you owe tonight. The ledger can wait until morning, if it waits at all. Breathe slowly. Let the warm dark of those old riverlands settle over you. We have only just begun to walk this long road, and there is so much more of it still to come, unspooling gently into the night. Let us go back then to the idea that almost everyone carries without ever questioning it. The idea that long ago, before money, people simply swapped things. You had a chicken, I had a pot. And if I wanted your chicken and you wanted my pot, we traded. Tidy, sensible. The story goes that this got inconvenient, all this swapping, all this hunting, for someone who wanted exactly what you had and had exactly what you wanted. And so clever humans invented money to smooth it all out. That is the version in the textbooks. That is the version Adam Smith set down in 1776 in the book that founded modern economics. He described a world that began in barter and reached, by reason and convenience, toward coins. It is a beautiful story. It is also, as far as anyone can tell, not true. And before we wander further down this quiet road, let me ask you something, gently, with no need to answer unless you feel like it. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Some warm country, some cold one, some city full of light, or some house at the edge of the dark fields? I find myself curious about the map of all the places these slow stories travel to. If you would like to, leave a word below before you drift off. And if you are new here, and you would like more nights like this one, you can subscribe, and the next slow journey will find you when you need it. That is all. Now let us go back to the river. Here is the trouble with the barter story. No one has ever found it. Anthropologists have spent a century and more living among small societies all over the world, the kinds of communities the barter story imagines, and they have looked and they have not found a single one that actually ran this way. Caroline Humphrey, an anthropologist at Cambridge, put it as plainly as it can be put. No example of a barter economy, pure and simple, has ever been described. Not one. The thing that was supposed to be the foundation of everything turns out to be a place no one has ever visited. So what was there instead in those small worlds where everyone knew everyone? Not haggling, not the cold arithmetic of swap. Something warmer and stranger and far older. A web of gifts. You gave your neighbor a haunch of deer, and you did not name a price, and you did not expect a pot in return that same afternoon. You simply gave, and the giving was remembered. A debt of honor, soft and unspoken, settled quietly between you. I will remember that you gave me this. One day, when you are in need, I will be there. The exchange was not a transaction that ended. It was a relationship that continued. David Graeber, an anthropologist who spent years inside these questions, gathered all of this into a book with a title that tells you exactly where the truth lies. Debt, the first 5,000 years. His argument, drawn from all that patient fieldwork, runs against the comfortable story like a current against a boat. Credit came first. Obligation came first. The memory of who owed whom came first, long before there was any coin to settle it with. We did not begin by trading objects and then invent debt. We began in debt, the soft debt of gift and gratitude, and only much, much later did we cast it into metal. There is a place that shows this with almost unbearable beauty, far out in the warm waters of the Pacific. Early in the last century, an anthropologist named Bronislaw Malinowski went to live among the Trobriand islanders, and in 1922 he set down what he had seen in a book called Argonauts of the Western Pacific. He described something the islanders called the Kula ring, and once you have heard of it, you never quite think about trade the same way again. Across a wide ring of islands, scattered over the open sea, two kinds of treasure moved endlessly for generation upon generation. Red shell necklaces called solava traveled in one direction around the ring, passed from island to island, hand to hand, clockwise. And white shell armbands called mwali traveled the other way, counterclockwise, against the necklaces, forever crossing them. Men would set out across dangerous open water in canoes, risking the sea, to carry a necklace to a distant partner and to receive an armband in return, which they would themselves carry onward to someone else later, when the time was right. The treasures were never kept, they were always moving. To hold one for a while was an honor, to pass it on was the whole point. And here is the thing that undoes the barter story completely. These valuables were not useful. You could not eat a shell necklace or shelter under an armband. Their worth was entirely in the relationship they carried. A Kula partner was a partner for life, bound to you across the sea by the slow passage of these beautiful, useless, sacred things. The trade was the bond, the exchange was the friendship, the goods was simply the thread that held distant lives together across the water. So when economists spoke of the great problem that money supposedly solved, the problem they called the double coincidence of wants, they were describing a friction that real human beings almost never let themselves get tangled in. The problem goes like this. For pure barter to work, the man with grain must find, at the very same moment, someone who has the fish he wants, and who also happens to want grain in return. Both wants must coincide in the same two people at the same instant. And of course, much of the time they do not. The man with grain wants fish, but the man with fish wants a pot, and the man with the pot wants grain, and round it goes, a knot that never quite ties. The textbook says money cut this knot. But the truth the islands and the fieldwork show us is that people never really tied the knot in the first place. They reached instead for credit, for memory, for the soft promise of, I will remember. You took the fish you needed, and the debt sat quietly between you and the fisherman until the day it could be answered. The whole brittle machinery of simultaneous swap was simply stepped around, gently, by trust. And trust, it turns out, needs a memory. When a village is small, the memory lives in everyone's head. Everyone knows who gave what to whom, who is owed, who owes. But as the gatherings of people grew, as the first towns thickened along the rivers of Mesopotamia, the web of debts grew too large for any one mind to hold. The grain owed to the temple, the barley owed by one household to another, the rations promised to the workers. Somewhere in that swelling tangle of obligation in the land called Sumer, between roughly 3,300 and 3,000 years before our era, human beings reached for something to help them remember. And what they reached for would change everything that came after. They pressed their fingers into wet clay. It sounds simple, almost accidental, as if someone sitting beside a river on an ordinary afternoon just happened to pick up a handful of mud and find, in the pressing of a thumb, the solution to a problem that had been quietly strangling civilization in its cradle. But it was not accidental. The clay tokens that came first, small, handheld objects shaped into cones and spheres and discs, each shape standing for something different. A cone for a measure of grain, a sphere for a jar of oil, a disc perhaps for a sheep. These were the first attempt to give debt a body outside the human mind. You pressed a cone into wet clay to say, this much grain is owed. You set the token aside. The debt now lived somewhere other than in memory. Denise Schmandt-Besserat spent years tracing these objects, pulling together evidence scattered across dozens of ancient sites, and what she reconstructed was one of the most consequential chains of cause and effect in all of human history. The tokens, she showed, were eventually sealed inside hollow clay balls. Envelopes, really, for a world without paper. And those envelopes, those rounded clay containers called bulli, would be pressed on the outside with an impression of whatever was sealed inside, so that anyone handling the envelope could know its contents without breaking it open. And then, at some point that must have felt as routine as any other working morning, someone realized that the impressions on the outside of the envelope were sufficient, that the tokens inside need never exist, that the mark could carry the meaning. The impressions became signs. The signs grew more stylized, pressed with a reed cut at an angle into the wet clay surface. The signs became the wedge-shaped script we call cuneiform, and cuneiform in its first centuries was overwhelmingly an accounting technology, not poetry, not prayer, not the recording of kings' names or gods' demands. The first literate humans wrote receipts, they wrote ration lists. They wrote the records of how much barley had come in and how much had gone out and who was responsible for the difference. Commerce literally wrote the first words. The need to remember who owed what to whom pressed human beings into literacy the same way a hand presses a finger into clay, with a kind of urgent, practical force that left a permanent impression. And then there is Kushim. The name appears on tablets from Uruk, the great city on the banks of the Euphrates, and the tablets date to around 3,100 years before our era. Kushim, possibly a personal name, possibly a title, the scholars still debate this, and the uncertainty is real, appears associated with quantities of barley, with the tracking of goods in and out of some kind of storage or administrative institution. What we know is that this name, or something functioning as a name, is among the earliest recorded in all of human history. The oldest name we can read, in the oldest surviving writing, belongs not to a hero, not to a king, not to a priest. It belongs to a bookkeeper counting sacks of barley 5,000 years ago in a city on the Mesopotamian plain. Civilization introduced itself to the written record through the utterly ordinary figure of someone doing the accounts. The ledger came before the legend. The city of Uruk, where Kushim worked or lived or counted, was itself a creature of exchange. It sat on the floodplain of southern Mesopotamia, which was extraordinarily fertile, the silt-rich alluvial plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates could grow grain in quantities that astonished, but which had almost nothing else. No stone worth quarrying, no timber of any significance, no metal. The plain provided bread. The plain could not provide the rest of what a growing, increasingly complex human community needed. So Uruk reached outward, turning its surplus into a kind of gravitational pull, drawing in the materials it lacked through networks of exchange that spread across hundreds and eventually thousands of kilometers. A city is, at its structural core, a place where exchange concentrates. Uruk, at its height, may have housed 40,000 people or more. 40,000 people eating, building, making, disputing, and praying, all of it made possible by the steady, invisible flow of goods along the trade routes threading toward and away from its walls. But we are getting slightly ahead of ourselves because the question of what law those early trades ran on had not yet been settled, and that settlement, when it came, arrived in stone. The Code of Hammurabi was inscribed on a black diorite stele, a column of stone about 2 meters high, and it was erected around 1754 years before our era, in the reign of the Babylonian king Hammurabi. You can stand before it today in the Louvre in Paris, and what you see is a king receiving the laws from the sun god Shamash, carved in relief at the top, and then below that, column after column of cuneiform text, close-packed and precise, running down the surface of the column like a waterfall of obligation. There are roughly 282 provisions in total, and a remarkable number of them have nothing to do with murder or property boundaries or the punishment of criminals in any sense we might initially expect. They are about trade. The code set interest rates. It distinguished between loans of grain, which could carry a certain rate, and loans of silver, which carried another. This matters because it means that by 1754 BCE, lending at interest was already so normal, so embedded in everyday commercial life, that a king felt the need to cap it, to prevent lenders from charging rates so ruinous that borrowers could never climb free. The problem of predatory lending is not a modern invention. It is old enough to have its own entry in one of the world's earliest law codes, old enough to have required a king's intervention. The code regulated the tamkarum, the traveling merchant, the long-distance trader who carried goods from one city to another, navigating roads and rivers and the permanent uncertainty of whether his goods would arrive. And it regulated the shamalum, the agent who served the merchant, the subordinate who took goods on consignment and was expected to sell them and return with an accounting. What happens when the agent claims the goods were lost or stolen? What happens when the merchant disputes the accounting? Hammurabi's code had answers. The agent must provide witnesses to any claimed loss. If no witnesses could be produced, the agent would be liable. The merchant and the agent would split any profits documented in a written contract. Written. Already. Already there were contracts. Already there was an expectation that commerce operated on documentation, on the ledger, on the record. There were rules about goods lost in transit. If a man had hired a boat, and the boat sank, and the goods were lost, the code addressed whose loss that was. If a merchant gave silver to an agent for a trading journey, and the agent lost the silver, the agent must repay double. The specificity is almost startling, not because these problems are unusual, but because they are so recognizably human, so absolutely continuous with the kinds of disputes that still end up in courts today. Commerce was already complex enough, contentious enough, nuanced enough in its potential for misunderstanding and dishonesty that it required a legal code. And by 1754 BCE, it had one. What Hammurabi's stone column tells us, if we read it slowly and let it breathe, is that long-distance trade was not a novelty in his time. It was a mature, established, already complicated practice that had generated enough disputes to fill a law book. The merchants and their agents had been out on the roads for generations before Hammurabi decided to regulate them. How many generations? This is where the story reaches back further than you might expect. There is a substance called obsidian, volcanic glass, formed when lava cools rapidly, dark and translucent, and when knapped with skill, capable of producing an edge so fine it approaches the sharpness of a surgical blade. It was, for our Neolithic ancestors, one of the most prized raw materials in the world. And it has a remarkable property that modern science has turned to account. The chemical composition of obsidian varies by source. The specific mix of trace elements in a piece of volcanic glass is something like a fingerprint, unique to the particular volcano that produced it, and obsidian can be matched with considerable precision to its origin. When archaeologists did this work, when they chemically fingerprinted the obsidian blades and cores turning up at ancient sites across the Near East and compared them to the volcanic sources, the results were extraordinary. Obsidian from the volcanic highlands of Anatolia, from specific mountains known to geologists by the names Golu Dağ and Nenezi Dağ, was showing up at sites more than 1,000 kilometers away. Not just tens of kilometers, not just across a neighboring valley, 1,000 kilometers. And these sites were not young, they were 9,000 years old, 9 millennia before our era, long before writing, long before the wheel, long before the first city had risen above the Mesopotamian plain. People were moving valued materials across vast distances. The desire to trade, to obtain what one's local world could not provide, is not a feature of civilization. It is one of the forces that built it. If obsidian gives us one kind of evidence, chemical fingerprints traced across centuries, then lapis lazuli gives us another kind entirely. The evidence of beauty, of desire, of what human beings were willing to move mountains, almost literally, to possess. Lapis lazuli is a stone of deep, saturated blue, flecked with gold where particles of pyrite catch the light. It is the color of a clear sky just after sunset, the color of the sea at a depth where it becomes something other than mere water. And in the ancient world, this color, this precise, impossible blue, was obtainable from almost nowhere. The great deposits of lapis lazuli, the source that fed the ancient world its blue for thousands of years, came from a single region. The Sari Sang mines of Badakhshan, in the mountains of what is now northeastern Afghanistan. From those mines, lapis lazuli traveled. It traveled to Mesopotamia, where it appears in royal tombs and on the decorative inlays of furniture and jewelry from the 3rd millennium BCE. It traveled to Egypt. And here is the detail that makes the distance feel real, that gives the trade route a human face. It traveled to Egypt and was worked into the funeral mask of Tutankhamun, the young king who died around 1323 years before our era. That famous golden mask, the one every schoolchild has seen in photographs, the one that has become perhaps the most recognizable object of the ancient world. The blue you see in the stripes of the headdress, the blue of the eyes, the blue that offsets all that gold. That blue came from Afghanistan, from a single set of mines in a mountain valley thousands of kilometers away. And it was moved there not by any modern mechanism of global supply chains and container ships, but by the same basic human impulse that moved the obsidian. Someone wanted it, someone had it, and between those two facts, a network of exchange did its work across a span of time and distance that should, by ordinary intuition, have made it impossible. What kind of network? Not the simple, direct kind. Not a caravan that set out from Badakhshan and arrived in Thebes with its load of blue stone intact. Almost certainly a relay, hand after hand, trade after trade, the lapis lazuli passing through intermediary communities, each adding its own margin, each extending the reach of the chain. Long-distance trade in antiquity was not organized like a modern shipping route. It was organized like a game of pass the parcel, played across a continent in slow motion over decades and centuries. And it worked. The blue reached the pharaoh's tomb. The network held. But the relay trade, impressive as it was, had a ceiling. Moving lapis lazuli or obsidian in small quantities through intermediaries was one thing. Managing a serious volume of goods across a serious distance, with contracts and credit and accountability at each end, that required something more organized. It required, in effect, a firm. And the oldest documented example of something that looks recognizably like an international trading firm turns out to be very old indeed. The city of Kanesh, Kultepe in the archaeology, in what is now central Turkey, was a prosperous Anatolian trading center in the early 2nd millennium BCE. And at some point around 1900 years before our era, it became home to a community of Assyrian merchants, traders from the city of Ashur, which lay roughly 1,000 kilometers to the southeast in northern Mesopotamia. These merchants did not simply visit, they established themselves. They built a trading colony on the outskirts of the city. The Assyrian word for such a colony was karum, and from this base they conducted business. The business, in its basic outline, was straightforward. Tin and textiles traveled from Ashur to Kanesh by donkey caravan, a journey of approximately 1,000 kilometers across the Anatolian plateau. In return, silver and gold traveled back. What is not straightforward, what makes this not just an interesting trade route, but a window into a recognizable commercial world is the paperwork. Over the course of the 20th century, archaeologists excavated the ruins of Kanesh and found, sealed in the burned or collapsed mud brick of the ancient buildings, more than 23,000 cuneiform tablets. 23,000, the largest private archive from the ancient Near East. And these tablets are the everyday working documents of those Assyrian merchants. The contracts, the loan agreements, the letters of instruction, the shipping records, the complaints when a consignment arrived short, the arguments about who had defaulted on what. If you read them, and scholars have spent careers doing exactly this, you are not reading history in the abstract. You are reading the mail. There are partnership contracts specifying how profits will be divided. There are loan records with terms and interest rates. There are letters instructing agents in Kanesh how to price the textiles in the current market, or complaining that the quality of the tin in the last shipment was not what had been agreed. There are legal disputes referred to the Merchant Communities Council for adjudication. And there are personal letters, a merchant writing home to his family in Ashur, his wife writing back. Among the letters that survive is one from a wife in Ashur to her husband in Kanesh, and the tone is one that crosses 3,900 years without losing any of its directness. She is asking for money. She needs silver for household expenses. She has not been sent what she was promised. She is managing without it, but she would like the matter addressed. The letter is not angry, exactly. It has the patient, slightly weary quality of someone who has made this request before and expects to make it again. She would not have been surprised in some sense to know that we are reading her letter now. She wrote it on clay which does not decay. She pressed the words into something permanent, and the permanent thing that she and her husband and their colleagues created, a network of trade running 1,000 kilometers governed by contracts and credit and the expectation of accountability, is recognizable in its structure to anyone who has ever done business. The Karum at Kanesh was not a primitive approximation of commerce. It was commerce, functioning, documented, legally regulated, personally painful commerce in 1900 BCE. While the Assyrian merchants were pressing their contracts into clay on the Anatolian plateau, a very different civilization was managing its own trade networks far to the east. The Indus Valley civilization, centered on the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in what is now Pakistan, flourished from roughly 2600 to 1900 years before our era. And it has left behind, among its other mysteries, a remarkable object, small stone cubes cut with precision, used as weights. Weights are, in one sense, the most elementary commercial technology imaginable. You put the goods on one side of a balance and the weights on the other, and the balance tells you what the goods are worth in agreed terms. Simple. But the Harappan weights are not simply functional. They are evidence of something more complex, a regulated, standardized, trust-based trading economy operating across hundreds of kilometers. The weights follow a system. The ratios are binary at the smaller end, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, and decimal at the larger end, and the consistency of this system across the entire civilization, from Harappa in the northeast to Mohenjo-Daro in the south, is extraordinary. These were not local standards, varying from city to city the way medieval European weights often did. They were uniform. A merchant traveling from one Indus Valley city to another could trust that the weights in use at his destination corresponded to the weights he had left behind. And this uniformity, extended across hundreds of kilometers of geography, implies something that does not happen by accident. It implies regulation, agreement, and the enforcement of standards. Someone, some institution or network of institutions, was ensuring that the weights matched. Commerce had already generated in the Indus Valley 4,000 years ago the need for a standards body. The civilization traded beyond its own borders as well. Indus seals, small, square, carved objects bearing distinctive pictographic script and animal imagery used perhaps as merchants' marks or trade tokens have been found in Mesopotamia, and the trade routes that connected the Indus Valley to the Persian Gulf world ran through two intermediate points that appear in the cuneiform texts: Dilmun, which is the island now known as Bahrain, and Magan, which corresponds to Oman. Dilmun was an entrepot, a staging post, a place where goods from one direction met goods from another and were redistributed. Through Dilmun and Magan, copper from Oman moved toward Mesopotamia, and the products and seals of the Indus Valley appear in the archaeological record of the Gulf. The Indian Ocean trade, the great maritime network that would shape world commerce for millennia, was already ancient in the second millennium BCE. These were not simple people living in a simple world. They were running international supply chains, enforcing standards, navigating currencies and credit, and disputing contracts, all without leaving us the direct linguistic key that would let us read their script, which remains undeciphered. The Indus Valley civilization is one of the great enigmas of the ancient world precisely because it was large enough, organized enough, and commercially sophisticated enough to have left substantial records, but those records are still, as of this telling, unread. The weights are eloquent, the seals are suggestive, the script is silent, and then, as the second millennium BCE drew on, as the Indus civilization contracted and eventually disappeared from the archaeology, as the Bronze Age world of the Eastern Mediterranean reached its complex interconnected height, another group of traders was building the network that would carry not just goods, but the very tool of literacy into the wider world. They were the Phoenicians. The Phoenician cities, Tyre and Sidon and Byblos, clustered along the narrow coastal strip of what is now Lebanon, pressed between the sea and the mountains behind them, were not powerful in the way empires are powerful. They did not field great armies, they did not conquer vast territories. What they had was ships, and what those ships gave them was the sea. The Phoenicians became the merchant mariners of the early first millennium BCE. Their ships, built from the famous cedars of Lebanon that grew in the mountains behind their cities, traveled the length of the Mediterranean and beyond, to Cyprus, to the Aegean, to the coasts of North Africa, to the Iberian Peninsula. They founded colonies along the way: Carthage in North Africa, Cadiz on the Atlantic coast of Spain. They were the carrying trade of the ancient Mediterranean world, the people in the middle who moved everyone else's goods for a price. They exported many things: timber, metalwork, wine, glass. The Phoenicians were accomplished glassmakers, and glass was still valuable enough to trade. But the product most identified with Phoenician wealth, the export that more than any other turned their coastal cities into synonyms for luxury and power, was a dye. Tyrian purple. The name already tells you its origin. It came from Tyre, and it came from a snail. The murex snail is not at first glance a promising source of civilization-defining wealth. It lives in the shallow coastal waters of the Mediterranean, in its shell going about its unremarkable business. But within its body, the murex produces a secretion that, when extracted and exposed to air and sunlight, undergoes a chemical transformation and becomes a dye of extraordinary staying power. A dye that bonds permanently to wool or linen and does not fade in sunlight and does not wash out. The color it produces ranges from a reddish crimson to a deep, saturated purple, depending on the species of murex used and the details of the process. The problem is the quantity required. To dye a single garment, one robe, one length of cloth, you needed not dozens of murex snails, but thousands. Some estimates run to 10 or 12,000 snails per gram of dye. The smell of the process, the decomposing snails, and the chemical extraction was apparently overwhelming. The dye works were kept outside the city walls for reasons of basic olfactory tolerance. Along the Phoenician coast, ancient midden heaps, the accumulated debris of centuries of snail processing, still exist hundreds of tons of crushed murex shells testifying to the industrial scale of the operation. And the result of all this effort, all this smell, all this labor, was a cloth so expensive that it became the color of kings. Tyrian purple, the color that runs through the robes of Roman emperors, that appears in the vestments of Byzantine royalty, that is still in some deep cultural encoding associated with royalty and power, acquired its meaning not from any inherent visual quality, but from economics. It was hard to make, it was expensive to acquire. To wear it was to announce, in a form that anyone who understood the system could read, that you could afford the impossible. The snail made the emperor's robe, the trade made the snail's dye into power. But the Phoenicians carried something else along their trade routes, something ultimately more consequential than purple cloth, something that has outlasted every garment they ever dyed and every cargo they ever carried. They carried an alphabet. The Phoenician script was a consonantal alphabet. It recorded the consonant sounds of the language and left the vowels to be inferred by the reader from context, the way an experienced reader of English can usually work out what a text means, even if all the vowels are removed. It was not the first writing system in the world. Cuneiform had existed for more than 2,000 years before the Phoenician alphabet crystallized into its mature form. But it had a quality that cuneiform did not. It was simple. Where cuneiform required hundreds of signs, each representing a syllable or a word or an idea, the Phoenician alphabet managed with 22 signs. A person of ordinary intelligence could learn them in a matter of weeks, rather than the years of scribal training that cuneiform demanded. This simplicity was not an accident, and it was not purely aesthetic. It was a merchant's solution to a merchant's problem. If you are running a trading network across the Mediterranean, if you need contracts and shipping records and letters of credit and price lists and correspondence between agents in different cities, you need a writing system that your traders can actually use, not one that requires a dedicated specialist just to read it. The Phoenician alphabet was legible to the merchant himself. It democratized literacy in the same way that a pocket calculator democratized arithmetic. It put the tool into the hands of the people who needed it most. And like the goods the Phoenicians carried, the alphabet traveled. It spread along the trade routes, adopted and adapted by the peoples the Phoenicians traded with. The Greeks took it and added vowels, a modification that made it even more precise, even more legible, and called it, with the names of its first two letters, the alphabet. From the Greek alphabet came the Latin alphabet. From the Latin alphabet came the scripts of most of modern Europe. From those scripts came the letters you are reading now, or hearing spoken now, in this quiet moment. The sounds and shapes that carry these words to you tonight are the children of a merchant's tool developed in Tyre and Sidon and Byblos 3,000 years ago, refined for the purpose of writing a bill of sale. Somewhere in the deep logic of that fact is something worth sitting with as you begin to drift. The letters themselves, the very mechanism by which meaning moves between minds, carry in their structure the fingerprints of commerce. Not just commerce as an abstraction, but the specific, practical need of specific people to write down what was owed and what had been paid and what remained in dispute. The Phoenician trader who pressed his consonants into wet clay or incised them into wax or scratched them onto a potsherd was not thinking about the future of human communication. He was thinking about the shipment of copper from Cyprus, or the consignment of wine for the colony at Carthage, or the debt that his agent in the Aegean had failed to repay. He was thinking about the cargo. And the cargo, in its demand to be recorded, in its insistence on being tracked and tallied and remembered, shaped the very tool by which we now tell each other stories. This is the pattern that runs through all of it, through the clay tokens of Sumer and the tablets of Kanesh, and the weights of Harappa, and the murex dye vats of Tyre. Commerce does not simply follow civilization. Commerce generates the instruments of civilization and leaves them behind when it moves on to the next transaction. Writing, law, standardized weights, the alphabet. These things were not invented by philosophers or kings in the abstract pursuit of progress. They were invented by people trying to solve specific practical problems generated by the need to exchange. And the need to exchange was itself generated by something very simple: the fact that the things people needed were almost never located where the people who needed them happened to be. The obsidian was in the Anatolian highlands, and the cutting tools were needed on the plains. The lapis lazuli was in the mountains of Badakhshan, and the blue was needed in the tombs of Egypt. The tin was in Ashur, and the silver was in Anatolia. The copper was in Oman, and the cloth was in Mesopotamia. The gap between where things were and where they were wanted, that gap, that structural inconvenience of geography, is the engine of everything we have been describing. Every step in this story is, at bottom, a human response to that gap. A response that began with someone picking up a piece of volcanic glass on the slopes of a mountain and recognizing that someone, somewhere, would give something for it. A response that grew through the slow accumulation of trust and obligation and memory and paperwork into the Kula ring, into the Karum at Kanesh, into the standardized weights of Harappa, into the dye-stained workshops of Tyre. The mechanisms changed. The scale changed, the tools for recording and enforcing and organizing the exchange changed with each century, but the engine was the same, the gap and the human willingness, the specifically, stubbornly, endlessly human willingness to cross it. The Code of Hammurabi tried to regulate that crossing. The tablets of Kanesh documented it. The Harappan weights standardized it. The Phoenician alphabet gave it a voice that echoed down 3,000 years. And yet all of this, the obsidian roots and the lapis lazuli chains and the donkey caravans of the Assyrian merchants and the murex-stained harbors of the Phoenician coast, was still, in a sense, operating at the edge of something. At the edge of a transformation that would change the nature of trade itself, not just its range or its documentation, because all of these networks, for all their sophistication, for all their legal frameworks and their standardized weights and their merchant alphabets, still ran on a fundamental awkwardness, the question of what to pay with, the question of how to carry value from one place to another across different communities with different customs and different measures in a form that everyone could accept. The question, in short, of money, not money as a concept. Credit and obligation had filled that role for millennia, and the Kanesh tablets are full of silver measured by weight, which is a form of commodity money. But money as a portable, standardized, state-guaranteed object. Money that a stranger could accept from another stranger without having to assess its purity, without having to weigh it against their own set of standards, without having to already know and trust the person on the other side of the transaction. That kind of money, coins in the sense we would recognize, was still waiting. Not far off now. Just beyond the edge of this part of the story, waiting in the river valley of a small but prosperous kingdom on the western edge of Anatolia, where a river ran heavy with flecks of gold and silver mixed together in a natural alloy that the Greeks would eventually call electrum. And in that valley, sometime around 600 years before our era, a king would do something with that metal that would change commerce as thoroughly as the alphabet had changed the recording of it. But that story and the cities it built and the empires it fed and the long networks that spanned from China to West Africa on its logic, those are what the night ahead holds. For now, let the merchants of Kanesh settle their accounts. Let the weights of Harappa sit steady on their scales. Let the purple dye dry on the cloth folded in the warehouses of Tyre, waiting for the ships that will carry it into a world still learning, slowly, how to price what it desires. And it is the city, more than anything else, that makes the question of money urgent. A village of a few hundred people can manage its exchange through relationship. Everyone knows the potter, the farmer, the butcher, the woman who keeps bees. Debts are remembered. Gifts create obligation. The double coincidence of wants, that awkward problem of needing to find someone who both has what you want and wants what you have, is not so impossible when the network of people you must search is small enough to hold in your head. Trust is personal. It is carried in the face, in the handshake, in the knowledge of someone's family going back 3 generations. But a city is different. A city is, in some fundamental sense, the problem the village doesn't have. Uruk, in its peak, centuries around 4,000 years before our era, may have held 40,000 people within its mud brick walls and spreading suburbs. A number so large it is difficult to hold clearly, especially against the background of a world where 40,000 was an extraordinary concentration of human beings in a single place. 40,000 people who did not all know each other. 40,000 people who could not all rely on the memory of shared history, of favors exchanged, of social obligation built up across years of proximity. 40,000 people who needed every day to buy grain and sell labor and acquire the small daily necessities of life from strangers, people they had never met, people whose word they had no particular reason to trust. And yet Uruk worked. Uruk was not merely a place where people happened to cluster. It was a machine of exchange, a place where goods arrived and left in quantities that dwarfed anything the earlier village world had managed. Grain from the floodplain fields outside the city walls, stone and timber and copper brought in from distant highlands because the Mesopotamian alluvial plain, fertile as it was, produced almost none of the raw materials that a civilization needs beyond food. The city sat structurally at the center of a web of exchange, drawing surplus from its hinterland, trading that surplus outward for what it lacked, and in the process becoming the place where the terms of all that trade were negotiated, recorded, and enforced. The grain temple at the center of Uruk was not only a religious building, it was a warehouse, a redistribution center, a bank of a kind. The priests who managed it were, in the language of later economics, administrators of a command economy, deciding who received what and recording those decisions in clay. But alongside the temple's managed distribution, traders and merchants moved through the city's streets, making deals that the temple did not entirely control. The city was both. It was planned and improvised, administered and negotiated. And out of that friction, out of the daily press of 40,000 people trying to get what they needed from each other, grew the institutions, the weights, the seals, the contracts, the standardized measures that the wider world of commerce would eventually inherit. There is a useful way to think about what a city does to trade, and it involves imagining a market square on a busy morning. Not a modern market, something older, simpler, more immediate. Stalls piled with produce. Merchants calling their prices. Someone trying to sell a bolt of cloth to someone who is mostly interested in lentils and working out whether the exchange is fair. In that square, on that morning, the practical problems of exchange crystallize into forms you can watch. How do you price cloth against lentils? How do you divide a transaction when what one party has is not neatly equal in value to what the other party wants? How do you handle the case where the cloth merchant wants to buy lentils today but will not have cloth ready to sell for another week? These are not abstract problems. They are the ordinary arithmetic of the marketplace, and the city multiplied them to a scale that demanded systematic solutions. The Greeks understood this, at least intuitively, even if they worked it out in retrospect. The agora, the open public space at the heart of every Greek city, was a marketplace first and a civic forum second. The word itself carried both meanings, a place of assembly, a place of exchange. The great debates, the philosophical conversations, the democratic deliberations that we associate with classical Athens, all of them happened in a space whose primary purpose, whose original and continuing function, was buying and selling. The agora in the morning was a market. The agora in the afternoon might be a court or an assembly, but the merchants and the philosophers breathed the same air and walked on the same stones. And it is not entirely wrong to say that Socrates was philosophizing in a marketplace, that Greek democracy grew up between the fish stalls and the olive oil sellers. The Romans named their equivalent the Forum, and the same logic applied. The Roman Forum, that sunken space of temples and columns and honorific arches that tourists walk through today, began as a market, a flat valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills that was convenient for traders because it sat at the junction of several paths. The religious and political buildings came later, built around and above the commercial function that had been there first. Power in the ancient world tended to grow where exchange was already happening, not the other way around. But it was Rome itself, the city of Rome, not just its forum, that demonstrated most dramatically what a civilization built on trade could achieve and what it required to sustain itself. At the height of the empire, the city of Rome held somewhere near 1 million people within its walls and immediate environs. 1 million? In a world without railways, without mechanized farming, without refrigeration or canning or any of the technologies that modern cities depend on to feed themselves. 1 million people who ate every day, who needed wine and olive oil and garum, that pungent fermented fish sauce that the Romans put on almost everything, their equivalent of salt or soy sauce, who needed timber for buildings and fuel, cloth for clothing, pottery for every household use. The city could not feed itself. There was no question of this. The agricultural land within any reasonable distance of Rome could not have supported 1 million mouths. The grain that fed Roman citizens came from far away, principally from Egypt, the ancient breadbasket, where the Nile's annual floods had been depositing rich silt for millennia, and where, under Roman administration, the production and export of wheat was managed with the seriousness of a strategic resource. From North Africa as well. The territories around Carthage, once Rome's great enemy, and now its most productive province. Tens of thousands of tons of grain every year loaded onto ships and carried across the Mediterranean. The Romans called this supply the annona, a word meaning roughly the year's provisions, the grain supply that had to arrive on schedule for the city to function. Managing the annona was a matter of state survival. Emperors who failed to keep the grain flowing faced riots. Emperors who kept it flowing earned a grudging loyalty that no military victory could quite replicate. The phrase bread and circuses, by panem et circenses, which the satirist Juvenal used to describe what the Roman crowd demanded, was not a joke about gluttony. It was a political reality, the understanding that a city of 1 million hungry people was an explosive problem, and that keeping them fed was the first duty of power. To move all that grain, Rome built and maintained a remarkable infrastructure. Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber, served for centuries as the port of Rome, the place where ships unloaded and goods began the final journey upriver to the city. When Ostia's harbour silted up and became difficult for large ships, the Emperor Claudius began work on a new port just north of Ostia, which his successor Trajan expanded into the great harbour complex known as Portus, a hexagonal inner basin, precisely engineered, capable of sheltering hundreds of ships at once, connected to the city by canal and road. It was, in scale and sophistication, one of the great feats of ancient infrastructure, a monument to the logistical demands of feeding a city that trade had made possible, and that only more trade could sustain. And the scale of what passed through those ports left a memorial that is still standing, though most visitors walk past it without recognition. On a hill in the Testaccio neighborhood of Rome, close to the old port on the Tiber, there rises a mound roughly 45 meters high and about a kilometer in circumference. It looks at first like a natural hill, slightly irregular, its slopes softened by grass and a few trees. It is not a natural hill. Monte Testaccio. The name comes from testae, the Latin for broken pottery sherds, is made entirely of the broken remains of olive oil amphorae, the large clay jars in which olive oil from Spain and North Africa was shipped to Rome. When the amphorae arrived at the warehouses of the port, they were unloaded, the oil was transferred to other containers or sold directly, and the empty jars were discarded. They could not be reused. Olive oil residue in fired clay eventually goes rancid and taints whatever is stored next, and so they were smashed and piled, systematically, carefully, not simply dumped, but stacked in layers with a coating of lime to suppress the smell and stabilize the structure. For perhaps 300 years or more, this process continued, ships arriving from the olive-growing provinces, jars unloaded and broken, and added to the pile, the hill growing steadily larger. When it was finished, when the port's activity eventually shifted, and the practice of discarding amphorae there ceased, the total number of jars embodied in that hill was somewhere around 53 million. 53 million clay jars, each one representing a journey. Oil pressed in the groves of Betica in what is now southern Spain, or in the farms of Tripolitania in what is now Libya, packed into a jar sealed with a clay stopper, loaded onto a ship in a provincial port, carried across the sea to Ostia or Portus, unloaded, carried to the warehouses, sold, the oil dispensed and the jar broken, and added to a hill that is still there today that you can visit, that neighborhood restaurants have built their cellars into, because the constant temperature inside the broken pottery makes it naturally cool, like a vast ceramic refrigerator built by the waste of empire. Monte Testaccio is the most concrete monument to ancient trade that exists anywhere on Earth. Not a temple or a palace or a road, a garbage heap, the literal physical residue of the Roman supply chain. A hill made of the evidence that people were buying and selling continuously at a scale that the modern world did not reach again for many centuries. And to sustain all of this, the ships, the warehouses, the grain distribution, the armies that protected the trade routes, the officials who managed the annona, the merchants who moved the goods. You needed money, not credit and obligation, not weighed silver bars, not cattle or grain used as a rough measure of value. You needed something smaller, more portable, more universally acceptable, stamped with authority, divisible into denominations, carrying its own guarantee of worth. You needed coins. The story of how coins came into being is, like so many things in the history of commerce, both more prosaic and more interesting than the clean narrative of inevitable progress that later accounts tend to impose on it. Start with what came before coins, because the gap between credit-based exchange and stamped metal coinage was not a sudden leap, but a long, gradual approach across several different kinds of money, each solving part of the problem. Cattle were among the earliest widely recognized stores of value. Not just useful animals, but units of account, a way of denominating wealth that everyone could understand and assess. The Latin word pecunia, which means money, comes from pecus, meaning cattle. The deep etymology of the word for money in the language that shaped so much of Western legal and commercial thought is simply cows, not metaphorically, etymologically. At some point in Rome's pre-monetary past, cows were the money, and the word for money remembered it long after the cows were replaced by bronze and silver. Grain served a similar function in many agricultural societies: storable, divisible, universally needed, possible to price other goods against. The grain rations recorded on those early Sumerian tablets were not just food. They were a form of payment, a way of compensating workers and settling debts in a commodity everyone valued. Salt has been proposed as another early currency, particularly in regions where it was scarce, and there is a story, repeated often, and often with great confidence, that the word salary comes from the Latin salarium, related to sal, salt, because Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt or given money to buy it. This etymology is debated, and the claim that soldiers were literally paid in salt is not firmly established, so it is better held as a possibility rather than a certainty. But the underlying logic is sound. Any commodity that is portable, durable, divisible, and universally desired can serve as money, because money is a function, not a material. Cowrie shells, the small, smooth, glossy shells of the mollusks of the genus Cyprea, served as currency across an enormous range of societies and territories for millennia. From West Africa to South Asia, from China to the islands of the Pacific, these shells circulated as money because they were naturally standardized. Each shell is roughly the same size and shape as others of its species, difficult to counterfeit, pleasing to handle, and portable enough to carry in quantity. The world's most geographically widespread money was a shell, not gold, not silver, a shell that children pick up on beaches that was once so plentiful along the coasts of the Maldive Islands that it was harvested and exported by the ton to serve the monetary needs of continents it had never grown near. All of these, cattle, grain, salt, shells, weighed bars of metal, were commodity money, meaning their value derived from their intrinsic usefulness or desirability, not from any authority's decree. They solved some of the problems of pure credit exchange. They were acceptable to strangers, they could be counted and weighed and roughly standardized, but they still had problems. Cattle are inconvenient to divide and difficult to carry on a sea voyage. Grain spoils. Shells can be gathered in large quantities by anyone with access to the right coastline. Weighed metal is more reliable, but every transaction requires someone to actually weigh it and assess its purity, which puts us back in the position of needing either skill or trust. The stroke of insight that produced the stamped coin solved this last problem by a method so elegant it is easy to miss it. The coin took a piece of metal of known weight and purity, and it put the authorities' mark on it. That mark, with the image of a king, a god, a city symbol, did not change the metal. It did not add value. What it did was transfer the burden of verification. Instead of every merchant having to weigh and assess each payment, the coin's mark said, "Someone with authority and reputation has already done this." The king has guaranteed that this piece of metal weighs what it claims to weigh and contains the metal it claims to contain. If you trust the king, and you have good reason to, because the king's ability to tax you depends on his currency being accepted, then you can accept the coin without weighing it. A coin is, in this analysis, a piece of portable trust, a piece of metal that carries pressed into its surface the guarantee of an institution that has more to lose from fraud than any individual merchant does. Every coin is a little piece of outsourced faith. The place where this first happened, as best as archaeology and historical sources together can establish, was the kingdom of Lydia in western Anatolia in the early decades of the 7th century before our era. Lydia occupied the fertile valleys and rugged uplands of what is now western Turkey, a prosperous and strategically placed kingdom that controlled trade routes between the Aegean coast and the interior of Anatolia. And through the Lydian heartland ran a river called the Pactolus, which carried in its gravels a natural alloy of gold and silver in proportions that occurred nowhere else in quite the same way. The Greeks called this alloy electrum, the word that would eventually give us electricity, because amber, which they also called electron, carried static charge. The natural electrum of the Pactolus was not pure gold or pure silver, but something between, a pale, slightly greenish gold metal that was beautiful, workable, and valuable. Lydian kings, probably beginning with King Aliates sometime around 600 years before our era, began striking small pieces of this electrum into standardized lumps stamped with the mark of the royal house. Not perfectly round, not beautifully designed by the standards of later Greek coinage, the first coins were more like chunky beans of metal with a punch mark, but standardized in weight, marked with authority, and issued in enough quantity to circulate through the markets of Western Anatolia and the Greek trading cities of the Aegean coast. Aliates' son was Croesus. Croesus, who would become the last king of Lydia before the Persian conquest, who accumulated wealth so extraordinary that his name became a byword for it. Rich as Croesus. The phrase appears in Greek sources and has never quite left the language, even in a world that has seen wealthier men than Croesus by orders of magnitude. The source of Croesus's legendary wealth was partly the Pactolus gold and partly the commercial advantage that issued from being the state that controlled the most reliable early coinage in the region. When you mint the money, you shape the market. Croesus refined the coinage, separating the natural electrum into its component metals and minting separate coins of pure gold and pure silver, a step that made the coins easier to evaluate and more precisely valued, since the ratio between gold and silver could fluctuate and electrum's mixed nature made it harder to price. With pure metal coinage, the monetary system became cleaner, more flexible, more capable of spanning different kinds of transactions. And then coinage spread with a speed that tells you how urgently it was needed. Within a generation or two of the Lydian innovation, the Greek city-states were minting their own coins, each city with its own emblems, its own weight standards, its own guarantee. Athens with its owl, Corinth with its flying horse, each city-state essentially declaring itself a monetary authority, issuing its own portable trust. The Persian Empire, absorbing Lydia, adopted coinage for its own purposes and produced the gold daric, named probably after Darius, the great Achaemenid king, which circulated throughout the vast Persian imperial system as a reliable standard of value for merchants and officials alike. What made coinage spread so fast was not just commercial convenience. Though commercial convenience was enormous, it was also, crucially, the needs of states. An empire or a city-state that raises an army faces an immediate arithmetic problem. Thousands of soldiers need to be paid regularly in something portable and universally acceptable. You cannot pay a mercenary with a promissory note that he cannot spend in the next village. You cannot easily pay him in grain if he is marching through territory where grain is either scarce or in the hands of people who are trying to kill him. Metal coins, portable, durable, and acceptable everywhere because the state that struck them has power enough to guarantee them, solve this problem elegantly. The Greek mercenary economies of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, the armies of Alexander that crossed Asia to the borders of India, the legions of Rome, all of them depended on coined money as the fuel of military power. And on the other side of the ledger, states that needed to collect taxes across large territories found coins equally useful. A farmer who owes taxes can pay them in grain, but grain must be transported, stored, assessed for quality, and converted into something else if it is to be used for purposes beyond feeding people. Coins can be counted, stored compactly, and sent anywhere. The ability to collect taxes in coin rather than in kind was a significant administrative simplification that made larger, more complex states possible. Coinage was not just a tool of merchants, it was a tool of empire. By the time coinage had spread across the Mediterranean world and into the Persian and later Hellenistic empires, something had shifted in the structure of long-distance trade. The networks that now carried goods between distant places were larger, more formalized, more capable of handling strangers than any earlier system had been. And with that increased capacity for reaching across distance, the networks of the ancient and medieval world achieved a geographic scale that, even now, is quietly astonishing. Consider what a well-traveled merchant around the year one of our era could have witnessed, or what a careful reader of the right documents could have pieced together. That a single thread of commerce with many links and many hands involved could connect the silk workshops of Han Dynasty China to the linen markets of Roman Egypt, the gold mines of West Africa to the spice ports of Arabia, the pepper groves of southern India to the dining tables of Rome. Not as a single journey, not as a deliberate world-spanning enterprise managed from a single center, but as a relay, a hand-to-hand passage of goods through many intermediate points, each transaction local, the cumulative effect global. The name we give to the great overland system is the Silk Road, but the name is misleading in ways that matter and worth pausing on before the actual network comes into focus. The term Seidenstraße, literally Silk Road in German, was coined by a geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877. Von Richthofen was a serious scientist, a careful observer who had traveled in China and was trying to map the routes by which in antiquity silk had reached the West. His term was useful, catchy, and completely anachronistic. No merchant who traveled any part of those routes ever called them the Silk Road. No Chinese or Central Asian or Persian document from the centuries when the trade was active uses anything like that phrase. The naming happened in a German scholar's study in the 19th century, nearly 1,000 years after the trade's most active medieval period and 2,000 years after its earliest flows. And the name misleads in a second way because it suggests a single road, a defined path with a start and an end and a surface you could walk on. There was no such road. There were instead multiple overlapping routes across Central Asia and the Middle East, varying by season, by political conditions, by the location of water sources and the reliability of particular mountain passes. A merchant did not set out from Chang'an with a load of silk and walk to Rome. Such a journey was almost never made in its entirety by a single person. What happened instead was relay. The merchant from Chang'an might travel as far as the oasis cities of the Taklamakan Desert, Dunhuang, Kashgar, and sell to a middleman there. That middleman might carry the goods as far as Samarkand in what is now Uzbekistan and sell again. From Samarkand, another merchant might take them west toward Persia, where another transaction would carry them to the ports of the eastern Mediterranean, where a final link might bring them to the warehouses of Alexandria or Antioch. The great middlemen of this relay system for many of the centuries when the routes were most active were the Sogdian merchants of Samarkand. The Sogdians were an Iranian-speaking people centered in the fertile valley of the Zarafshan River, and they built a commercial network across Central Asia that was, for its time, something like a multinational trading company spread across thousands of kilometers of steppe and mountain. Sogdian merchant letters have been found, actual physical letters written on paper and hidden in a watchtower on the edge of the Gobi Desert around the early 4th century of our era, describing trade in musk, silk, pepper, and silver, asking about market conditions, complaining about losses, sending family news. The everyday correspondence of a commercial network that stretched from China to the Roman world, preserved in the dry desert air for 17 centuries. Silk was the most famous good that moved along these routes, and it moved eastward to westward because the Romans and later civilizations of Western Asia and the Mediterranean were willing to pay extraordinary prices for it. Chinese silk production, the careful cultivation of mulberry trees to feed silkworms, the harvesting and reeling of the delicate filaments, the weaving of cloth of a smoothness and luster that wool and linen could not match, was a closely guarded technology for centuries. The secret of sericulture, the actual art of raising silkworms, did not reach the Byzantine Empire until the 6th century of our era, if the story that 2 monks smuggled silkworm eggs out of China in hollow walking staffs is to be believed, and perhaps not even then in any systematic way. But silk was only the most famous of what moved. Paper moved, invented in China and gradually spreading westward across the centuries as the technical knowledge diffused through the relay of cultures. Spices moved, pepper and cinnamon and cloves, whose prices in Roman markets were high enough that they represented significant stores of value, not merely flavoring. Glass moved westward to east. Roman glass found in Chinese tombs is startling to contemplate, this fragile luxury somehow surviving the passage of the Silk Road. Horses moved eastward to westward, the famous blood-sweating heavenly horses of Fergana that the Han dynasty went to considerable military trouble to acquire, because good cavalry horses were a strategic resource in the warfare of the steppe. And ideas moved too. Buddhism spread from India to China along these routes, carried partly by merchants who built monasteries at the oasis stops and whose donations funded the art of dunhuang, those painted caves in the desert that preserve, sealed in dry air, some of the most extraordinary religious art anywhere in the ancient world. The overland routes were extraordinary, but they were not the whole story, and for the sheer volume of trade measured in tonnage, the bulk goods, the grain and timber and spices and metals, the sea was more important. The Indian Ocean, looked at as a trading system, had a structural advantage that no overland route could match: the monsoon. The monsoon is a seasonal reversal of wind direction, driven by the differential heating of the land and ocean masses of Asia. In summer, the landmass of the Indian subcontinent heats up faster than the surrounding ocean, drawing moist air in from the southwest by the southwest monsoon, which brings rain to the Indian subcontinent, and which, for a sailing vessel, represents a reliable wind blowing from Arabia and East Africa toward India. In winter, the land cools faster than the ocean, and the airflow reverses, blowing from the northeast monsoon, which carries ships from India back toward Arabia and the East African coast. This reversal, this annual clockwork of wind, made the Indian Ocean into something almost like a scheduled service. A merchant could calculate within a few weeks when to set out and when to expect to return. The voyage from the Arabian coast to India was predictable, the voyage back was predictable. The geometry of the monsoon turned a vast and potentially dangerous ocean into a highway with known seasons and reliable directions. Sailors had been using this system for centuries before anyone bothered to write it down systematically, but the document that survives from the 1st century of our era as a record of it is a Greek merchant's handbook known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, the Erythraean Sea being the ancient Greek name for the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea together. The Periplus is not literature. It does not pretend to be. It is a practical guide for merchants who intend to sail these waters, which ports are worth calling at, what goods are available where, who rules each port and what he prefers to receive as gifts, what the sailing conditions are like at different seasons, what the going prices for pepper and ivory and cotton and silk tend to be. It reads in some passages like a very ancient travel guide and in others like a ship captain's logbook, and its existence tells us that by the 1st century of our era, the Indian Ocean trade was organized and regular enough that someone found it worthwhile to compile a professional reference. The ports the Periplus describes range from Roman-controlled Egypt, Berenice and Myos Hormos, the Red Sea harbors where goods from India were unloaded and carried overland or up the Nile to Alexandria, around the coast of Arabia, across to the Indian subcontinent, where the ports of Barigaza and Muzuris and others are described with the matter-of-fact familiarity of a writer who has either visited them or spoken with many who have, and beyond, into hints of what lies further east in the direction of Southeast Asia and China. The Indian Ocean of the Periplus is a known world, a connected world, a world already organized around the rhythms of trade and the mutual knowledge of what each shore has to offer the others. East Africa sent ivory and tortoiseshell and slaves southward, Arabia sent frankincense and myrrh, India sent pepper, cotton, and precious stones. Southeast Asia sent spices whose names, nutmeg, cloves, mace, would one day drive European powers to circumnavigate the globe in pursuit of them. The circuit was ancient before it was famous, and it ran not on gold or ambition or the will of any single empire, but on the reliable clockwork of a seasonal wind that no king had commanded and no army could control. And then there was the third great network, running not across steppe and mountain or over open water, but across the largest desert on earth. The Sahara is not what most people picture when they picture a desert. It is vast in a way that is difficult to hold in the mind, roughly the size of the continental United States, stretching from the Atlantic coast of West Africa to the Red Sea, from the Mediterranean littoral to the margins of the Sahel. And across this immensity, for more than 1,000 years, camel caravans carried gold and salt in quantities that shaped the economies of two continents. The camel made it possible, not the horse. The horse cannot endure the heat and the long, waterless stretches of the Sahara's deep interior. But the camel, with its extraordinary physiology, the ability to go without water for days, the ability to eat almost any vegetation it finds, the broad padded feet that distribute weight on loose sand, the remarkable efficiency of its gait at the steady pace of the caravan. The camel was the ship of the desert in a literal functional sense, carrying cargoes across distances that would have been impossible for any other domesticated animal. The trade that moved across the Sahara was built on a fundamental geographic asymmetry. In the sub-Saharan forests and grasslands of West Africa, gold was present in the earth in quantities that made it possible to pan rivers and dig shallow mines and produce, over centuries, enormous tonnages of the metal. In that same region, salt, essential for human survival, for preserving food, for sustaining livestock, was desperately scarce. The forest belt had almost none. People needed it so badly that in some places salt reportedly traded near weight for weight with gold, a thing without which you cannot survive, matched in price against a thing that is, intrinsically, merely decorative. In the Sahara itself, by contrast, there were vast salt deposits, ancient lake beds dried into crystalline plains, where salt could be quarried in great slabs and loaded onto camels. North Africa had access to the products of Mediterranean civilization, cloth and metalwork and horses and grain, that the forest kingdoms of the south desired. The geography set up a relay: salt, south, gold, north, and a caravan trade connecting them across the desert. The empires that controlled the middle of this trade became, in their time, among the wealthiest political entities in the world. Ghana, Mali, Songhai, the great Sahelian kingdoms whose names recur in any honest account of medieval wealth. They sat astride the transit routes, taxing what passed through, using the proceeds to fund courts and armies, and eventually great centers of learning. Mali in the 14th century was a particularly extraordinary case. Its ruler at the peak of its power was Mansa Musa, and the story of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 is one of the most vivid single demonstrations of what the gold trade had made possible in the sub-Saharan world. Musa was Muslim, as the rulers of Mali had been for generations, Islam having arrived along the trade routes from North Africa, and the pilgrimage to Mecca was a religious obligation of the faith. He undertook it, by the accounts that survive, with a retinue of somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 people. An army of attendants, soldiers, officials, and hangers-on of a size that strains credibility, but that is reported consistently enough across multiple sources to be at least directionally believable. More to the point for our purposes, he carried with him an enormous quantity of gold. Some accounts mention 500 slaves each carrying a gold staff, scores of camels each bearing gold dust. Detailed figures vary between sources and some are certainly exaggerated, but the core fact is not in dispute. Mansa Musa arrived in Cairo in 1324 with so much gold that his spending and gift-giving during his stay, and the additional gold he distributed along his route, flooded the Egyptian market with the metal. Gold, like any commodity, responds to supply and demand. When a very large amount of gold suddenly becomes available in a market where the supply had been more constrained, the price of gold falls, which means, since gold was the reference standard for other prices, that the prices of other things expressed in gold rose. This is inflation. Mansa Musa caused inflation in Cairo, and the inflation persisted, according to later accounts, for more than a decade after his passing. The price of gold in Cairo had not fully recovered for something like 10 or 12 years. This is one of the most precise and human-scale demonstrations of a macroeconomic principle anywhere in medieval history. A single man on a religious pilgrimage, moving through a city, gave away so much of one thing that he changed its price for a generation. The gold of West Africa, carried north on camels by a trade that had been running for centuries, found its most dramatic moment, not in a market or a treaty, but in a king's devotion and his incidental destruction of the monetary equilibrium of a continent. The city at the southern end of the trans-Saharan routes, the city that grew rich as a transit point and then as a center of scholarship and culture in its own right, was Timbuktu. It sits near the great bend of the Niger River, where the river turns from flowing northeast to flowing southeast, a geographic feature that made it a natural gathering point for boats traveling the river and caravans arriving from the desert. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Timbuktu had become one of the great cities of the medieval world, not merely a marketplace but a city with universities and libraries where manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and theology were copied and traded alongside gold and salt. At its peak, it may have held 25,000 students enrolled in its schools, a number that placed it among the major centers of learning anywhere on Earth at the time. What trade had done, once again, was to concentrate surplus in a place and allow that surplus to be converted into something beyond mere survival. The gold of the Niger Bend, extracted from rivers and shallow mines by techniques of patient labor accumulated over generations, had been exchanged for salt and goods and horses across a desert relay that neither the miners nor the salt cutters could see in its entirety. The accumulation of profit at the trading centers had funded a city, and the city had funded learning, and the learning had produced manuscripts that contain knowledge, astronomical observations, medical treatments, legal reasoning, that historians are still working to fully recover. That is what trade does. That is what it has done over and over in every place and every century where the conditions aligned. It concentrates, it amplifies, it takes the surplus that one place has and converts it through exchange into the surplus that another place needs, and in the doing of that conversion it creates wealth that was in neither place to begin with, and the wealth becomes cities, and the cities become learning, and the learning becomes the accumulated knowledge of civilizations that look nothing like the original transaction, nothing like the farmer who had more grain than he could eat, nothing like the salt cutter chipping blocks in the Saharan glare, and yet were built on it all the way up. And yet the same roads that carried the gold and the salt, the silk and the spice, the lapis lazuli and the obsidian and the purple-dyed cloth of the Phoenician coast, those roads carried something else as well, something that moved just as quietly and just as efficiently as any bale of goods loaded onto a camel or lowered into the hold of a ship. It asked no permission. It paid no tariff. It moved through the very act of connection itself, through the closeness of bodies in markets and caravanserais and harbour towns, through the shared water jars and the bedding of inns and the holds of grain ships crossing predictable blue water. Disease rode the trade routes. It has done so for as long as there have been trade routes to ride. Consider what a trading network actually is, stripped of its romance. It is a system of regular, repeated contact between populations that would otherwise never touch. A grain ship sailing from Alexandria to Ostia carries wheat in its hold and sailors on its deck, and the sailors carry in their bodies every pathogen that circulates in the port they came from. The harbour town receives both. The grain feeds the city. The pathogen meets a population that has never encountered it and has built no immunity to it. The efficiency of the network, the very quality that made it valuable, becomes, in this other register, a kind of weapon that nobody aimed. The first great pandemic to move along established Mediterranean trade routes in a documented way arrived in the year 541 of the Common Era, during the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. The plague of Justinian, as it came to be called, entered the Byzantine world through the grain trade. Egypt was the empire's breadbasket, as it had been for Rome before it, enormous tonnages of grain moving year on year from Alexandria northward and westward to feed populations that had grown dependent on that supply. The ships that carried the grain were warm and dark below decks, full of the stored food that fed the rats that carried the fleas that carried the bacterium. The disease moved along the precise channels of the empire's commercial circulatory system, reaching the capital Constantinople within months of its first appearance in the ports of Egypt, and from there spreading to the ports of the Mediterranean world, wherever Byzantine shipping reached. The historian Procopius, who witnessed it in Constantinople, wrote of bodies stacked in the streets, of the living unable to keep pace with the dead. The population of the city fell sharply. The empire's tax base contracted. The military campaigns of Justinian, which had been reconquering large portions of the Western Mediterranean world, stalled and ultimately failed in part because of the catastrophic loss of people and the economic disruption that followed. A bacterium traveling in a grain ship's hold reshaped the political geography of the post-Roman world. And then came the other one. The one that those of you listening to this will know by its short, blunt name, the name that even now carries a certain quiet weight when you say it, the Black Death. It arrived in Europe in the year 1347, and by 1351 it had moved through the continent with a speed and thoroughness that no army in history has matched. It killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of the population of Europe in those 4 years, not 30 or 60% of one city or one country, but of the entire continent, from the trading ports of the Mediterranean to the fishing villages of the North Sea. Towns emptied, fields went unploughed. The labour that had built the cathedrals and turned the mill wheels and harvested the grain simply ceased in vast quantities all at once. The story of how it arrived in Europe is itself a story about trade. The Black Death reached the Mediterranean through the Black Sea port of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula, a city that was, in the mid-14th century, a Genoese trading post, a node in the commercial network that connected the eastern Mediterranean world to the trade routes of Inner Asia. Genoese merchants had established themselves there precisely because Kaffa sat at the meeting point of the overland routes from Central Asia and the maritime routes of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It was, in the language of networks, a hub. The disease arrived from the east, moving along the same overland routes that had carried silk and spice and horses for centuries. The Genoese ship sitting in the harbour at Kaffa, loaded with goods for the Mediterranean markets, carried the disease out when they sailed. They brought it to the ports of Constantinople, of Messina in Sicily, of Genoa and Marseille, and from those ports it moved inland. The very thing that made Kaffa valuable, its position at the junction of trade routes, the regularity and efficiency of the ships that called there, made it the perfect amplifier for what had arrived from the interior. The same efficiency, the same connectivity, the same qualities that had allowed Mediterranean commerce to feed 1 million people in imperial Rome now carried something no merchant had ordered and no sailor had knowingly loaded. The network did what networks do. It connected, and in connecting it killed. There is a way in which this is the darkest expression of the central truth of this whole story. Trade builds by connecting. Connecting carries risk. The larger and more efficient the network, the larger and more efficiently it carries everything. The goods that sustain life and the pathogens that end it. The Bronze Age palace system had been fragile because of its concentration and dependence. The medieval European trading network was, in a different way, vulnerable because of its very success at connecting populations across the continent and beyond. The Black Death was not caused by trade, but without trade, without the specific nodes and routes and ships of the Genoese commercial network, it could not have spread at that speed to that many people in that short a time. And after the Black Death, things changed. In ways that historians still debate, the catastrophic loss of population reshuffled the labor market of Europe. Workers who survived found themselves suddenly scarce and therefore more valuable. Wages rose, serfs negotiated their freedom. The rigid hierarchies of feudal society cracked, slowly and unevenly, along lines that the plague had opened. The world that emerged from the 14th century was not the world that had entered it, and the change had been delivered, in part, by the same ships that carried the spice and the silk. But the greatest biological disruption that trade would ever cause was still a century and a half away, and it would dwarf everything that had come before it. In 1492, the worlds of the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere, which had been separated by 2 vast oceans and had developed entirely independently for tens of thousands of years, were connected for the first time in any sustained, systematic way. The consequences of that connection were so large and so strange that the historian Alfred Crosby gave them a name in 1972 when he published his analysis, the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange was, at its simplest, a trade in biology, and it moved in both directions. From the Americas to the Old World traveled plants that would remake the agriculture and diet of Europe, Africa, and Asia beyond recognition. Maize, the potato, the tomato, the chili pepper, cacao, tobacco. The potato alone, carried back and planted in the soils of Europe and eventually China, would over the following centuries feed population explosions that the old grain-based agriculture could not have sustained. The tomato, which Italians now treat as though it had always been there, the essential soul of their cooking, arrived from the Americas sometime in the 16th century and was initially regarded with deep suspicion as a decorative plant, possibly poisonous. The chili pepper, which colonized the cuisines of India and Korea and West Africa and Southeast Asia with such completeness that the people of those places now find it difficult to imagine their food without it, is an American plant that had never existed anywhere else on Earth until European ships carried its seeds back across the Atlantic. And from the Old World to the Americas traveled wheat, horses, cattle, pigs, and sugar, along with something that no one had consciously loaded and no one would have chosen to send. The diseases of the Old World. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. The populations of the Americas had no immunity to these diseases. Their immune systems, shaped over thousands of years of isolation, had never encountered them. When the pathogens arrived, the results were catastrophic on a scale that is almost impossible to hold in the mind steadily. Estimates vary and the uncertainty is real, but some populations lost up to 90% of their people within a few generations of first contact. Entire societies, their languages, their knowledge systems, their agricultural techniques, their accumulated understanding of the landscapes they had tended for millennia, were gone before most Europeans had even heard of them. This was not a side effect of trade. It was trade in its most fundamental sense, the transfer of something from one place to another across a network. The network in this case was the Atlantic. The transferred things happened to be biological. The consequences happened to include demographic catastrophe on a scale without precedent in recorded history. Alfred Crosby's point in naming and tracing the Columbian exchange was not to reduce the horror to an economic phenomenon, but to insist on the biological reality of what had happened, to recognize that the connection of two hemispheres was not merely a political or commercial event, but an ecological one, that the trading networks humans built changed not just what people bought and sold, but what lived and died and where. The potato on your plate, if you live almost anywhere in the world, is an American plant. The horse that shaped so many of the societies of the Great Plains for 3 centuries had its ancestors brought from Europe. The chili in your dinner, the cacao in your evening chocolate, the maize in your morning cereal. These are the residues of a trade network, the biological sediment left behind by ships crossing the Atlantic 500 years ago. The foods on the table are a record of connection as much as any clay tablet or amphora shard. The world that trade remade is the world you eat in. Now, let the ships settle in their harbors for a moment. Let the camel caravans find their rest. And consider what was happening in parallel with all of this movement of goods and organisms in the way that human beings were learning to represent and transfer and multiply value without carrying it in their hands. Because while the trade routes of the physical world were doing their old work, moving goods, building cities, spreading disease, connecting the hemispheres, something else was happening, quietly and with enormous consequence, in the minds of merchants who were grappling with a problem as old as trade itself. How do you move value without moving the weight? How do you trade at a distance when the goods themselves are heavy and the roads are long and the seas are dangerous? The answer, it turned out, was paper. Or, more precisely, the idea that a piece of paper with the right words on it could represent value as reliably as the gold it described, if and only if the right people trusted it. China got there first, by a margin of centuries. In the province of Sichuan during the Song dynasty, in the 10th and 11th centuries of the Common Era, merchants who traded iron goods faced a particular inconvenience. Iron coins were real money, but they were enormously heavy. A string of iron coins sufficient to buy a bolt of cloth was a burden. A fortune in iron coins was a logistical nightmare. The merchants of Sichuan developed a solution. They deposited their iron coins with trusted merchants or establishments and received in exchange a piece of paper, a promissory note, an acknowledgement of the deposit, a document saying, in effect, that the bearer of this paper was owed that much iron coin by the issuer. These notes, called jiaozi, began to circulate as payment. If you trusted the issuer, you accepted the paper. The iron stayed in the vault. The paper did the traveling. The government of the Song dynasty recognized what was happening, recognized the efficiency of it, and eventually took over the issuance of these notes, producing the world's first state-backed paper currency. The paper was not the value. The paper was a representation of the value, a portable form of trust, the same thing that a coin had been, that a clay token had been, that a haunch of deer in the Kula ring had been, all the way back. What changed was only the medium. The mechanism was the same: get people to trust the representation, and the representation becomes, for all practical purposes, the thing itself. Marco Polo, returning to Europe in the late 13th century from his years at the court of Kublai Khan, described paper money to the Europeans he encountered, and they did not believe him. The idea that pieces of paper could function as money, that a government could decree that these sheets printed with official marks would be accepted as payment for goods and services, struck his audience as either a fantasy or a deception. They were wrong, of course, and they would have paper money of their own eventually, though it took Europe several more centuries to get there. But Europe was not idle in those centuries. It was solving the same problem from a different angle, driven by a constraint that China had not faced: the Church's prohibition on usury. Charging interest on a loan was, according to medieval Catholic doctrine, a sin. Money was not supposed to breed money. If you lent a man 10 coins and demanded 12 in return, you were extracting profit from time itself, and time belonged to God. The prohibition was widely held and periodically enforced, and it created a real problem for the merchant bankers of medieval Italy, who needed to lend money across long distances, who needed to earn a return on the capital they deployed, and who needed to do both of these things without technically charging interest. The solution they arrived at was the bill of exchange. It was, in its structure, beautifully simple and, in its consequences, one of the most important financial innovations in history. Here is how it worked. A merchant in Florence wants to send money to a business partner in Venice to pay for a shipment of goods. He does not want to carry the actual coins. Coins are heavy, roads are dangerous, and robbery is common. He goes instead to a banker in Florence and hands over his Florentine florins. The banker gives him a piece of paper, the bill of exchange, which instructs the banker's correspondent in Venice to pay out the equivalent sum in Venetian currency when the bill is presented there. The merchant carries the paper to Venice, presents it, and receives his money. No coins have traveled the road. The money has moved as information. But here is where the interest hid. The exchange rate between Florentine florins and Venetian currency was not fixed. It fluctuated, and the banker who set the exchange rate in the contract could set it in such a way that the value delivered in Venice was slightly less than the value deposited in Florence, or, better still, he could structure a return transaction that brought the difference back to him as an apparent profit on currency exchange rather than an explicit charge on a loan. The interest was real, the interest was paid, but it was hidden inside the exchange rate, and therefore it was not technically called interest, and therefore it was not technically usury. The Church's prohibition had been satisfied in form while being evaded in substance. The merchant bankers of Florence, Venice, and Genoa, and the name of the Medici family stands above the rest in the historical record of this era, as the great banking dynasty whose ledgers and letters survive in extraordinary detail, developed these techniques into a sophisticated international financial system. They had correspondents in every major trading city. They could move money from London to Cairo, from Bruges to Constantinople, through chains of bills and exchange rates and correspondent relationships. They were, in effect, running an early version of international wire transfers 2 centuries before anyone had invented a wire. And to keep track of it all, they needed better accounting. The accounting system that emerged from this world, the system that is still, without essential modification, the foundation of every set of accounts in every company in the world today, was codified in 1494 by a Franciscan friar and mathematician named Luca Pacioli in a book called the Summa de Arithmetica, Geometria, Proporzioni et Proporzionalità. The Summa was a comprehensive mathematical textbook, and the section on bookkeeping, describing a method that had been in practical use among Italian merchants for at least a century before Pacioli wrote it down, was a description of double-entry bookkeeping. Double-entry bookkeeping is, at its heart, a very simple idea with very large implications. Every transaction has 2 sides. When you receive something of value, something of equal value must leave you. When you spend, something must be gained. Every entry on one side of the ledger, the debit, must be matched by an equal and opposite entry on the other side, the credit. The 2 sides must always balance. If they do not balance, something is wrong. a mistake has been made, or someone has stolen, or a transaction has been recorded incorrectly, the balance is the check. The double entry is the audit. This sounds elementary, and in some sense it is. But the implications of having a system in which every transaction left two traces, in which the entire financial state of an enterprise could be read from a single balanced document, in which inconsistencies were automatically visible. These implications were enormous. It allowed merchants to understand at a glance whether they were profitable or not. It allowed them to detect fraud. It allowed them to plan. It allowed them for the first time to separate what they owed from what was owed to them, to see the total shape of their financial position rather than just a running list of individual transactions. It made large, complex commercial enterprises manageable in a way that they had not been before. Double-entry bookkeeping is, in its quiet way, one of the great organizational technologies in human history. The method that Luca Pacioli described in 1494 is the method that a multinational corporation uses today. The debits and credits still balance, they always must. But even with bills of exchange and double-entry ledgers, there remained a limit to the scale of commercial enterprise. The limit was risk. A single merchant, or even a partnership of merchants, could only finance voyages that they could personally afford to lose. And the voyages of the age of exploration, the long hauls to the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia, the circumnavigation of Africa, the crossings of the Pacific, were expensive, slow, and deeply uncertain. Ships sank, crews mutinied, cargoes were lost. A single failed voyage could ruin a family that had spent generations accumulating the capital that funded it. The solution to this problem was, like so many solutions in the history of trade, a mechanism for distributing risk. And the institution that embodied that solution was the joint stock company. The Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, universally known now by its initials, VOC, was chartered by the Dutch government in 1602. It was not the first trading company, but it was the first to solve the risk problem in a systematic and scalable way. The VOC issued shares to the public. Any person with money could buy a portion of the company, a share in its future profits, and in doing so, take on a proportional share of its risks. The capital of many investors pooled together could fund voyages that no single investor could have afforded alone. And if a voyage failed, the loss was spread across the whole pool rather than falling catastrophically on one family. The shares were tradable. This was the innovation that changed everything. You did not have to hold your share in the VOC until the company wound up its affairs. You could sell it to another investor at whatever price you and they agreed on and get your money back, or a profit if the company had prospered in the meantime, or a loss if it had not. To facilitate this trading in shares, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange came into being, a physical place where shares could be bought and sold, where prices could be discovered, where investors could convert their holdings into cash. This is where the stock market was born. Not in the abstract, not as an idea, but as a practical mechanism growing out of a practical problem. How do you fund a spice voyage to the other side of the world? In a specific city, in a specific year. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange was the direct ancestor of every stock exchange that exists today, the direct institutional ancestor of the screens and the algorithms, and the trading floors where the shares of the world's largest companies change hands 10,000 times a second. And the VOC itself was, for most of the 17th century, the largest company in the world by any measure. At its height, it operated more than 150 merchant ships, 40 warships, had 50,000 employees, and returned, in its best years, dividends of 40% on capital invested. It was a sovereign power in its own right in parts of Southeast Asia, minting its own coins, running its own armies, making its own treaties. The joint stock structure had allowed the Dutch Republic to effectively outsource empire to a commercial enterprise, funded by thousands of ordinary investors who had bought a piece of the spice trade. This is the mechanism, the joint stock company, the tradable share, the stock exchange, that underlies the industrial world, the modern corporation, the global capital market. All of it grew from the same question that had always animated trade. How do you move value? How do you distribute risk? How do you get the surplus of many to fund the ventures of a few? The answer was always a mechanism of trust, a clay token, a coined disc, a bill of exchange, a share certificate. The medium changed. The function was constant, and yet there is one more thing that the history of trade teaches, and it is perhaps the most sobering lesson in this long story. Because alongside all of this, the cities and the alphabets, the coinage and the ledgers, the joint stock companies and the stock exchanges, the history of trade also contains the record of its own catastrophic failures, the networks that vanished, the systems that collapsed, the prosperity that lasted a century and then within a single generation disappeared so completely that for centuries afterward the people living in its ruins did not know what they were the ruins of. Around the year 1200 before the Common Era, the Eastern Mediterranean was the most densely connected, most prosperous, most sophisticated region on Earth. The great palace states of the Bronze Age, Egypt, with its gold and its papyrus and its long reach along the Levantine coast, the Hittite Empire of Anatolia, with its iron and its armies and its horses, the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, with their palaces at Mycenae and Tiryns and their far-ranging merchant ships. The city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, which sat at the intersection of maritime and overland routes, and had grown, on that intersection, into a cosmopolitan city of merchants and scribes and traders speaking a dozen languages. These powers were connected to each other and to the wider world in a web of trade that was, for the ancient world, remarkably dense and varied. Bronze requires two metals, copper and tin. The copper, in large quantities, came primarily from Cyprus. The island's very name is the root of the word for copper in Latin and in English. The tin came from far away, from sources that historians still debate. Perhaps from Afghanistan, perhaps from Cornwall, perhaps from multiple sources along different routes. Neither of these metals existed in the same place. Bronze was, in the most literal sense, a globalized product, requiring a supply chain that connected mines on one side of the ancient world to smiths on the other, and the palace states of the Eastern Mediterranean sat at the center of that chain, organizing its movement, taxing its profits depending on its continuity. The letters found in the burned ruins of Ugarit, clay tablets baked hard by the fire that destroyed the city, and therefore preserved, include some of the most haunting documents from the ancient world. They are letters written in the final days of the city, probably in the years around 1185 BCE, as the Bronze Age world was collapsing around it. One letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia, or probably Cyprus, reports that enemy ships have been seen at sea, that the king's troops and chariots have been sent elsewhere, that the harvest has already been cut. It reads as a cry for help from a ruler who knows that something terrible is approaching and does not have the means to stop it. The reply, if one was ever sent, has not been found. The city of Ugarit was burned and was never rebuilt, and was so completely forgotten that the mound covering its ruins sat undisturbed until French archaeologists began excavating it in 1929. What happened? The honest answer is that historians do not fully know. The Late Bronze Age collapse, as it is called, the near-simultaneous failure of almost every major political entity in the Eastern Mediterranean within the space of roughly 50 years, between about 1200 and 1150 BCE, is one of the great unsolved questions of ancient history. There is evidence for invasions from groups that the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples There is evidence for drought. There is evidence for internal revolts. There may have been earthquakes. The debate continues, but one thing the material record shows clearly is this: the very interconnectedness that had made the Bronze Age system so rich was also what made it so fragile. The palace economies were not self-sufficient. They depended on the regular arrival of tin from far away, and copper from Cyprus, and cedar from Lebanon, and gold from Egypt and Nubia, and grain from the agricultural heartlands. Each node depended on every other node. When the system worked, it worked spectacularly. When it stopped working, when the ships stopped arriving, when the caravans stopped coming, when the tin supply dried up and the smiths could not make bronze and the armies could not equip themselves, the whole system could not find a way to function because it had been organized on the assumption of its own continuity, and it had no redundancy, no backup, no way to substitute local resources for the distant ones on which it had grown to depend. The palace at Mycenae fell. The Linear B script, the writing system of the Mycenaean Greeks, which had been used to keep the palace accounts, because writing always, in the beginning, keeps the accounts, disappeared for 5 centuries. The Greeks of the classical age did not know that their language had once been written. The knowledge of writing, which in every other region of the ancient world was maintained by merchant continuity, was broken here because the merchant network collapsed along with the palaces that had organized it. This is what concentrated, interdependent fragility looks like when it fails. Compare it to the Indian Ocean system. The monsoon-driven maritime network that connected East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia, that the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea had mapped in the 1st century of the Common Era, continued through all the political upheavals of 2,000 years, the fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, the Mongol invasions, the Black Death, the European age of exploration, to function in some form continuously. It was not organized from any single center. No single palace or empire ran it. The Sogdian merchants, who were the great middlemen of the inner Asian routes, based in their city of Samarkand, were not the agents of any state. They were independent traders who operated wherever the trade was profitable, shifting routes when one path closed, finding alternatives when one market dried up. The network was distributed. Its resilience was a function of its distribution. No single point of failure could bring it down because it had no single point. It had nodes, and nodes could be lost, and the network would route around them because there were always other nodes. This is the lesson that the whole arc of trade history seems to contain if you are willing to look at it steadily and without romance. The networks that endured were not the largest, or the most sophisticated, or the richest. They were the ones that could survive the loss of any single part. The ones that had built redundancy into their structure, not as a deliberate design choice. The Sogdian merchants were not thinking about network theory, but as an emergent property of the fact that many independent actors pursuing their own profit along many different routes create, without intending to, a system that is harder to kill than any planned network from a single center. The late Bronze Age palaces were rich and powerful and interconnected and brilliant, and they are gone. The Indian Ocean trade is still there. And so we reach the end of the story, or rather, the place where the story opens out into the present and becomes impossible to separate from the world you are lying in now, in the dark, listening to this. Because that is the thing about the history of trade. It does not end. It does not arrive at a destination. It is a river that is still running, and you are living on its banks, and almost everything you can see from where you sit was built by it or carried to you along it. The phone or the speaker or the device through which you are hearing this voice was assembled from components made on 5 continents, moved through ports that would have been recognizable in function, if not in scale, to the merchants of Ugarit. The food in your kitchen contained species that crossed oceans centuries ago, traded unknowingly, planted by farmers who had no idea they were planting the biological residue of a commercial network. The financial system that prices the goods in those markets, that moves the money, that pays the wages, that buys the food, its deep structure, the debit and the credit that must always balance, was laid down by a Franciscan friar in Florence in 1494, who was himself codifying a system that Italian merchants had developed to hide interest inside the exchange rate, which they had done because a medieval church had told them that money must not breed money. Think about the clay token. Think about the small shaped piece of clay, cone for grain, a sphere for a measure, a disc for a sheep, pressed into the wet surface of a clay envelope 5,000 years ago in the cities of ancient Sumer. That action, that small patient gesture of pressing a mark into clay so that a transaction could be remembered, was the beginning of writing. Not the writing of poetry, not the writing of prayer, the writing of a receipt. And from that receipt grew cuneiform. And from cuneiform grew the concept of the recorded word. And from the recorded word grew every text that has ever existed, every letter and every law and every poem and every book that human beings have read and written in all the years since. The first word was a receipt. Everything else is a footnote. Think about Kushim, counting sacks of barley at Uruk around the year 3100 before the Common Era, whose name survives on a clay tablet not because they were a king or a general or a prophet, but because they kept the accounts honestly, and the accounts were worth keeping. The oldest personal name in all of human history belongs to a bookkeeper. This is what trade made first, not glory, not war, not religion. A reliable record of who had what and who owed whom. Think about the Kula ring, the great ceremonial circuit of the Trobriand Islands that Bronislaw Malinowski described in 1922, the red shell necklaces traveling clockwise and the white shell armbands traveling counterclockwise year after year, binding people together in relationships of mutual obligation that were not transactions, but something older and deeper. The recognition that the person across the water is a person, that what passes between us creates a connection that matters more than what was exchanged. Trade as relationship. Trade as the refusal to be a stranger. Think about the obsidian from the volcanic mountains of Anatolia, from the specific peaks of Göludağ and Nenezidağ, moving 1,000 kilometers and more from the source 9,000 years ago, finding its way into the hands of people who had never seen a volcano and had no idea where this strange, sharp, beautiful black stone had come from, moving along relay chains of gift and exchange and trust, hand to hand, each person passing it to the next, across distances that none of them traveled themselves. Building a network that reached further than any individual journey because it was not a single journey, it was thousands of short ones, connected by the simple fact that people wanted things they did not have and were willing to give something in exchange. Think about the lapis lazuli from the single mountain source in the Sari Sang mines of Badakhshan, that one blue-veined mountain in the high valleys of what is now Afghanistan, supplying the whole ancient world with its most prized pigment and gemstone, reaching the funeral mask of Tutankhamun, reaching the temples of Sumer, reaching the grave goods of the Indus Valley cities thousands of kilometers away in 3 different directions, and doing so not because anyone organized it from the center, but because each link in the chain found it worth their while to pass it on. Think about the Genoese merchants at Kaffa, and the grain ships at Alexandria, and the rats in the hold, and the fleas and the bacterium traveling in the dark, the same efficiency that fed a city now killing it, the price that connectivity sometimes charges, the shadow side of the same thing that makes the network valuable. The world is connected. That means everything travels. The wheat and the disease, the silk and the plague, the potato and the smallpox. The connection is not good or bad. It is the condition from which everything else, the good and the terrible both, follows. Think about the burned letters from Ugarit, baked hard by the fire that killed the city and preserved by the same fire for 3,000 years, a voice calling for help that no one answered, a king who did not know that the network on which his whole world depended was in the final weeks of its existence. And think about the Indian Ocean still running through all of that, the monsoon turning its reliable seasonal circuit as it had turned for millions of years before the first dhow set sail on it and would turn for millions of years after the last one. The redundant distributed system, organized by no one, surviving everything, carrying the trade from one season to the next and the next and the next. What money is, what it has always been, from the first cattle counted as wealth to the first electrum coin stamped at the river Pactolus, to the first jiaozi circulating in Song Dynasty Sichuan, to the first share certificate issued by the VOC in Amsterdam in 1602, is portable trust, nothing more and nothing less. Money works wherever people trust it, and it fails wherever they do not. The form is always secondary, the function is always the same. We need to be able to say, across distance and time, this is worth this, and we need the other person to believe us. That is what the clay token said, that is what the coin said, that is what the bill of exchange said, and the paper note, and the stock certificate. Each one is a different medium for the same ancient message. I trust you. You can trust me. We are, for the purposes of this exchange, connected. Every civilization that you have ever heard of was built inside that trust. The writing, the law, the city, the alphabet, the corporation, the university at Timbuktu with its 25,000 students. All of it sediment, all of it the accumulated residue of people reaching across the space between them and saying, with some object or some mark or some document or some digital signal, here, this is what I have, what do you have, and what might we build together out of the exchange? The river is still running. It has been running for 9,000 years, for the entire duration of what we call civilization, and for thousands of years before that, if you count the obsidian moving through the dark before writing existed. It will be running when the people who come after us are trying to understand how their world was built. They will find in the sediment the same story. Someone had something, someone else needed it, and between the two of them, something new was made. That is enough for one night. There is nothing more to explain. The whole story, from the clay token to the stock exchange, from the first clay receipt at Uruk to the bill of exchange hiding its interest in the exchange rate, from Kushim counting barley to Mansa Musa distributing gold in Cairo, has been told, and you have traveled the length of it, and you can rest inside it now. If you feel moved to share where in the world you are listening from tonight, I would genuinely like to know. The comments are there, and I read them. There is something right about that, at the end of a story, about how connection between people builds everything. That you should reach back across the distance and say, I was here, I heard this, I am in this city, this country, this quiet room. The network is still running. You are a node in it. There are more stories here of the same slow and careful kind, waiting for whenever you want them. Long, dark, patient stories about the things that built the world, told in the small hours for those who need something to fall asleep inside. The clay is cool, the tablets are at rest. Somewhere in the dark above the markets of Uruk, the stars are where they always are, turning their slow circuit, indifferent to the receipts and the records and the small human accounting below. The monsoon winds have stilled for the season. The ships are in harbour. The caravans have made their camp. The river Pactolus runs in the dark beneath the hills where the electrum was panned, carrying its slow freight of mineral sand toward the sea. You have done enough for one night. Put down whatever remains of the day. That's enough explaining for one night. Rest now.